The bar fell dead silent as the young enforcer shoved the frail old man, mocking the faded, blurry ink on his weathered skin. He thought he was intimidating a nobody. He didn't know he had just laid hands on the ruthless architect of the Hells Angels' most legendary era. The neon sign outside the Iron Horse Saloon buzzed with the erratic hum of a dying hornet, casting a flickering, blood-red glow across the cracked pavement of the Oakland streets. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale beer, motor oil, and decades of cigarette smoke baked into the wooden floorboards. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of quiet, dead-hour purgatory where only the ghosts of the past and the truly exhausted came to drink. In the darkest corner booth, nursing a lukewarm stout, sat Reuben. To the untrained eye, Reuben was just another piece of the bar's battered furniture. He was 78 years old, his frame lean and slightly stooped, wrapped in a scuffed, unpatched leather jacket that had seen more miles than most commercial airplanes. His face was a map of deep, cavernous wrinkles, his skin weathered into the texture of tanned hide by decades of relentless California sun and biting desert winds. But it was his hands that told the true story, thick, calloused, and covered in faded, bruised blue tattoos that had bled out over half a century, their original sharp outlines now reduced to blurry, unrecognizable smudges. Reuben didn't speak much. He didn't have to. He was a man who existed entirely in his own memories, a living relic of an era that modern bikers only read about in glorified paperback books. In his mind, he was still tearing down Highway 101 in 1957, riding shoulder to shoulder with the absolute titans of the outlaw world. He had been there when Otto Friedli helped lay the foundation for the original San Bernardino Charter. He had sat in cramped, smoke-filled garages with Ralph "Sonny" Barger, watching as the Oakland Charter was forged into the militant, unyielding brotherhood that would eventually terrify and captivate the entire globe. Reuben wasn't just a part of Hell's Angels' history. He was the ink used to write it. But time is a cruel eraser. The old guard had either died off, gone to prison, or simply faded into the peripheral shadows of the world, leaving the club to a new generation. The heavy wooden doors of the Iron Horse violently kicked open, snapping the quiet atmosphere in half. The harsh glare of the afternoon sun spilled into the dim room, followed by the deafening, thunderous roar of 3 modern, fuel-injected Harley-Davidson twin cams shutting off at the curb. 3 men swaggered into the bar, bringing a chaotic, arrogant energy that instantly sucked the oxygen out of the room. They were young, none of them a day over 30, and they were dressed in pristine, heavy denim cuts. The back of their vests proudly bore the iconic winged death head, framed by the stark red and white top and bottom rockers that read Hell's Angels and California. The leader of the trio was Garrett, a heavily muscled, brash enforcer with a fresh, tightly trimmed beard and eyes that constantly darted around the room, looking for a challenge. Flanking him were Dexter and Wyatt, 2 newly patched members who wore their colors like a shield of invincibility. They didn't ride rigid-frame panheads or leak oil on the asphalt. They rode $40,000 baggers with Bluetooth sound systems. They were the modern era, loud, well-funded, and entirely convinced they were the kings of the world. Loretta, the gray-haired bartender, who had been wiping down the counter, stiffened. Her eyes darted nervously toward Reuben in the corner, then back to the 3 young heavyweights marching toward the bar. She had been pouring drinks at the Iron Horse long enough to know the delicate, unwritten laws of the outlaw world. She also knew exactly who Reuben was, even if he hadn't worn his colors in public for over 20 years. 3 whiskeys. Leave the bottle, Garrett barked, not even bothering to look at Loretta. He leaned against the polished oak of the bar, hooking his thumbs into his heavy leather belt. He scanned the empty room with a look of profound boredom, his gaze sweeping past the empty pool tables and the silent jukebox before finally landing on the dark corner booth. He saw the old man. He saw the faded, scuffed leather jacket, and more importantly, he saw a target to entertain himself with. Garrett nudged Dexter, a sly, predatory grin spreading across his face. "Hey, look at the crypt keeper over there." Dexter chuckled, adjusting his pristine white and red AFFA, Angels Forever, Forever Angels, patch on his chest. "Looks like he wandered out of a nursing home. Think he even knows what planet he's on?" Reuben didn't flinch. He didn't even look up. He simply took a slow, deliberate sip of his stout. His ice-cold, pale blue eyes fixed on the condensation dripping down the side of his glass. In his prime, a comment like that would have ended with someone's teeth scattered across the sawdust floor. But Reuben had spent decades taming the monster inside him. He had nothing to prove to boys who were still swimming in their father's liquid when he was out establishing territories with iron and blood. But Garrett wasn't going to let it go. He was hopped up on the power of his newly minted patch, desperate to assert dominance in every room he walked into. He grabbed his whiskey glass, knocked it back in one fiery gulp, and pushed himself off the bar. "Let's go say hello to the local wildlife," Garrett sneered, the heavy boots of the three young angels thudding ominously against the floorboards as they closed the distance to Reuben's booth. The storm had arrived, and it was entirely blind to the hurricane it was about to wake up. Garrett slid uninvited into the booth opposite Reuben, the leather seat creaking loudly under his heavy, muscular frame. Dexter and Wyatt stood on either side of the table, crossing their arms to box the old man in. They were towering, intimidating walls of denim and muscle, wearing the legendary death head like a loaded weapon. Reuben slowly set his glass down. He didn't blink. He just stared through Garrett, looking at the young man with the kind of absolute, unnerving emptiness that usually only belongs to apex predators. "Nice spot you got here, old-timer," Garrett said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But this is a private club establishment. You know whose territory you're drinking in?" Reuben remained silent. He pulled a crumpled pack of unfiltered cigarettes from his front pocket, tapped one against the table, and placed it between his lips. He struck a match with his thumb, lighting it with a steady hand. He exhaled a thick plume of grey smoke, letting it drift directly into Garrett's face. Garrett coughed, his cocky smile faltering for a fraction of a second. Anger flashed in his eyes. He hated being ignored. He leaned forward, slamming his palms flat on the sticky wooden table. "I asked you a question, Grandpa. You blind or just stupid?" Garrett demanded, aggressively tapping the red and white California bottom rocker on his cut. "This is Hell's Angels territory. We don't take kindly to random civilians taking up space in our booths. I was drinking at this table before your mother figured out how to unbutton her jeans, boy." Reuben finally spoke. His voice was like grinding gravel, deep, raspy, and devoid of any fear. Dexter scoffed, stepping closer. "Watch your mouth, old man. You have no idea who you're talking to." Garrett held up a hand, stopping Dexter. He was smiling again, but it was a cruel, ugly expression. His eyes drifted down to Reuben's arms, resting on the table. The old man had rolled the sleeves of his jacket up slightly, revealing a chaotic canvas of severely faded, sun-damaged tattoos. They were the stick-and-poke variety from the 1950s, crude, blown-out lines that had melted into blurry blue shadows under the sagging skin. Garrett pointed a thick finger at Reuben's left forearm. There was a blurry diamond-shaped blob of ink with illegible text bleeding into the center. Right above it was an asymmetrical, almost cartoonish skull with wings, the original unrefined prototype of the modern death head, designed long before the club legally trademarked the logo. To the young bikers, who were used to pristine, machine-perfected ink, it looked like absolute garbage. "What the hell is that?" Garrett laughed loudly, looking back at his brothers. "Look at this. Are you wearing fake ink, old man? Did you let a toddler scribble on your arm with a Sharpie?" "Looks like a pigeon," Wyatt chimed in from the side, snickering. "You one of those weekend warriors? Bought a leather jacket at a thrift store and thought you'd pretend to be a badass?" Loretta, watching from behind the bar, felt her stomach drop into her shoes. She grabbed a rag, nervously twisting it in her hands. "Garrett, leave him be. He ain't bothering nobody," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Shut it, Loretta!" Garrett snapped, not breaking eye contact with Reuben. He leaned in closer, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey and bravado. "You know, the club has strict rules about civilians wearing our ink, even if it is a pathetic, knock-off scribble. Men have been put in the hospital for less." Reuben took another slow drag of his cigarette. "It's not a knock-off," he said softly. "It's the original, done in a garage in San Berdu, 59, long before the lawyers got involved." Garrett rolled his eyes, utterly dismissing the history lesson. "Right. And I'm the President of the United States. Look, I'm tired of looking at your face. Take the jacket off, leave it on the table, and get out of my bar before I show you how we deal with posers." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. The buzzing of the neon sign outside seemed to amplify. Reuben didn't move to take off the jacket. Instead, he leaned forward, closing the distance between his face and Garrett's. When he spoke, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I earned this jacket in blood," Reuben whispered, his pale blue eyes suddenly igniting with a terrifying, ancient malice. "I buried good men while wearing it. I put men in the dirt while wearing it. You wear your patch like a Halloween costume, boy. You buy your bikes with credit scores. You don't know the first thing about the Reaper." Garrett's face flushed crimson. The sheer disrespect from an unarmed, withered old civilian was too much for his ego to handle in front of his brothers. The young enforcer's temper snapped. "All right, you asked for it," Garrett snarled. He lunged forward, grabbing the heavy leather collar of Reuben's jacket with both hands. With a violent heave, Garrett yanked the old man up from the booth. Reuben's chair screeched loudly against the wooden floor as he was forced to his feet. Dexter and Wyatt instantly closed in, clenching their fists, ready to stomp the old man out the moment he hit the floor. Garrett raised his right fist, pulling it back to deliver a crushing blow to Reuben's jaw. But before the punch could land, the heavy wooden doors of the Iron Horse Saloon blew open with the force of a bomb going off. A massive, towering figure eclipsed the sunlight in the doorway. It was Big Hank, the current sergeant-at-arms of the Oakland Charter, a terrifying mountain of a man who commanded absolute, unquestioned respect across the entry and west coast. Hank stood at 6'4", his cut adorned with the rare, filthy few patch, his face scarred and hardened by years of actual bloody warfare. Hank took one look at the scene unfolding in the corner booth. Garrett, with his fist raised, holding the frail old man by the collar. The color instantly drained from Big Hank's face. His eyes went windward with sheer, unadulterated horror. "Garrett!" Hank roared, a sound that shook the very bottles on the liquor shelf. "Take your hands off him, now!" The sheer velocity with which Big Hank moved defied his massive, lumbering frame. The wooden floorboards of the Iron Horse Saloon groaned and splintered under his heavy motorcycle boots as he crossed the room in a blind, unadulterated rage. He did not issue a second warning. He did not ask for an explanation. The sergeant-at-arms was a man who had built his fearsome reputation on swift, brutal decisiveness, and what he was witnessing in the dark corner booth was a violation of the highest, most sacred order imaginable within the outlaw motorcycle community. Garrett barely had time to register the command before a hand the size of a catcher's mitt clamped down on his wrist. Hank's grip was like an industrial vice closing on fragile bone. With a guttural roar that echoed off the nicotine-stained ceiling tiles, Hank twisted Garrett's arm downward and violently yanked him backward. The young enforcer was entirely uprooted. His heavy boots left the floor as he was hurled through the air like a discarded rag doll. Garrett crashed hard into the adjacent wooden table, shattering the surface and sending a storm of glass beer bottles, overflowing ashtrays, and splintered oak raining across the floor. He crumpled into a pathetic heap against the wainscoting, gasping for air as the wind was forcefully expelled from his lungs. Dexter and Wyatt instantly froze, their previous bravado evaporating into thin air. Their hands, which had been balled into aggressive fists just seconds prior, sprang open and shot up into the air in a desperate gesture of surrender. The color completely drained from their faces, leaving them looking like terrified children caught playing with a loaded firearm. They knew better than to intervene when the sergeant-at-arms was executing discipline. To step in now meant forfeiting their own patches, and likely their own teeth. "Hank! What the hell, man?" Garrett coughed, spitting a mouthful of blood and sawdust onto the floor as he clumsily tried to push himself up onto his elbows. His eyes were wide with genuine confusion, panic, and the sudden, sharp realization of physical pain. "It's just some random civilian posing in our bar. I was handling it. The old freak was disrespecting the club, wearing fake ink." Hank did not look at Garrett. He did not acknowledge the complaint. Instead, the terrifying giant of a man turned his back on the three young bikers and faced Reuben. The atmosphere in the bar shifted violently. The aggression that had practically radiated from Hank's pores vanished, replaced instantly by an aura of profound, almost religious reverence. The sergeant-at-arms, a man who had stared down rival cartels and heavily armed riot police without blinking, slowly reached up and removed his sunglasses. He bowed his head, his massive shoulders slumping in a posture of complete submission and respect. "I am so deeply sorry, brother," Hank whispered, his gravelly voice trembling with an emotion that sounded dangerously close to genuine fear. "I had no idea you were coming down from the cabin today. If I had known, I would have had the entire charter here to properly receive you. This absolute disgrace." Hank swallowed hard, gesturing vaguely behind him toward the shattered table where Garrett was still groaning. "This is on me. I am responsible for their ignorance. I will handle this, Reuben. You have my word on my life." Garrett, finally managing to drag himself up into a kneeling position, froze, the blood dripping from his split lip momentarily forgotten. He stared at Hank's broad, denim-clad back in utter disbelief. He had never, in his 5 years of being a patched member, seen Big Hank apologize to anyone. Not to the charter president, not to the police, not to anyone. And he had just addressed this withered, scuffed-up old man as brother. Reuben slowly adjusted the collar of his weathered leather jacket, the very same collar Garrett had brutally grabbed moments before. He picked up his still smoldering unfiltered cigarette from the edge of the table, placed it between his lips, and took a long, measured drag. He looked at Hank, his pale blue eyes calculating and perfectly calm, showing absolutely zero adrenaline spike from the near assault. "You've let the bloodline get severely diluted, Hank," Reuben said softly, the raspy quietness of his voice carrying more weight than a gunshot. "You're patching in boys who think a heavy wallet and a loud mouth make them outlaws. They wear the patch like it's a corporate logo. They don't know the weight of the fabric." Hank nodded solemnly, accepting the devastating criticism without a single ounce of defense. "You are entirely right. We got sloppy. We prioritized numbers over character. It won't ever happen again." Dexter, trembling uncontrollably, finally found a fraction of his voice. "Hank, who is he?" he stammered, his eyes darting between the towering sergeant-at-arms and the quiet old man smoking in the booth. Hank slowly turned around to face the three young men. The reverence was gone, replaced once again by a murderous, suffocating fury. He stepped toward Dexter, pointing a massive, calloused finger directly into the young man's chest. "You arrogant, blind, pathetic little boys," Hank hissed, his voice vibrating with barely contained rage. "You walk around this city thinking you own it because you bought a Harley and put on a vest. You think that patch gives you power. You think it makes you gods?" Hank grabbed the lapels of Dexter's pristine leather cut, yanking him forward until they were nose to nose. "That patch doesn't give you power. It inherits power. Power that was bled for, starved for, and died for by the men who came before you. And you just laid your filthy, unearned hands on the man who poured the concrete foundation you stand on." Hank threw Dexter aside and turned his burning gaze onto Garrett, who was now clutching his bruised ribs, his face pale with a dawning, horrifying realization. "That man sitting in that booth is Reuben," Hank barked, his voice booming across the empty saloon. "He doesn't wear his colors because he doesn't need to broadcast to the world who he is. He is one of the original First 50. He rode side by side with Sonny Barger when this entire organization was nothing more than a few angry veterans looking for freedom on the highway. He was at Altamont. He was there during the Oakland raids in the 60s. When the federal government tried to wipe this club off the face of the earth, he was the one who stood in the courtroom and told them to go to hell." Garrett's jaw dropped. The whiskey in his stomach suddenly felt like battery acid. The legendary names and events Hank was rattling off were the sacred mythology of the club, the very stories Garrett had memorized as a prospect. "And those tattoos you were mocking?" Hank continued, his voice dropping into a dangerous, lethal register. He stepped over the broken table, towering directly over Garrett. "That blurry ink you called fake? That was done in Otto Friedli's garage in San Bernardino in 1959. That is the original death head. That tattoo is the reason you even have a patch on your back today. You just insulted the architect of your entire existence." The silence that blanketed the Iron Horse Saloon was absolute and terrifying. The only sound was the erratic buzzing of the neon sign outside and the ragged, panicked breathing of the three young bikers. The gravity of their mistake had finally crashed down upon them, crushing the air out of the room. They had not just insulted a senior member, they had committed an act of sacrilege against a living deity of the outlaw world. Reuben slowly stood up from the booth. His movements were stiff, betraying his 78 years, but there was an undeniable, predatory grace to the way he carried himself. He didn't look like a frail old man anymore. He looked like a dormant volcano that had just been disturbed. He walked out from behind the wooden table, his worn leather boots making soft, deliberate scuffing sounds against the floorboards. He walked past Dexter and Wyatt, not even granting them the dignity of a glance. They were ghosts to him, insignificant dust motes floating in the periphery of his vision. He stopped squarely in front of Garrett, who was still kneeling amid the shattered wreckage of the table. Garrett looked up, his eyes entirely stripped of their former arrogance. Tears of genuine panic welled in the corners of his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, to beg, to offer some kind of desperate apology, but his throat had completely seized up. The young enforcer, who had spent the last 2 years terrorizing rival gangs and establishing himself as a ruthless heavyweight, was entirely paralyzed by the sheer, unyielding presence of true, historical authority. "You asked me if I knew whose territory I was drinking in," Reuben said, his voice a low, raspy whisper that carried effortlessly across the silent room. He looked down at Garrett with a mixture of profound disappointment and deep, unshakable pity. "I mapped this territory. I bled on these streets before they were even paved. I watched my brothers die on this asphalt, so that 50 years later, boys like you could ride around on expensive toys and play dress-up." Reuben slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his crumpled pack of cigarettes. He took his time, deliberately tapping a fresh cigarette against his thumb before placing it in his mouth. He didn't light it. He just let it rest there as he stared down at the trembling young man. "You rely on intimidation," Reuben continued, his pale blue eyes piercing straight through Garrett's heavily muscled chest. "You use volume to compensate for the fact that you have absolutely no substance. A real outlaw doesn't need to announce his presence. A real outlaw doesn't need to put his hands on an old man to feel strong. You are soft, Garrett. You are a product of comfort, masquerading as a rebel." Garrett swallowed hard, a single bead of sweat rolling down his temple and stinging his split lip. I'm sorry. I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know who you were." "That is exactly the problem," Reuben replied instantly, the trap snapping shut. "You shouldn't have to know who I am to show respect. If you only show respect to the men who can destroy you, then you have no honor. You're just a coward hiding behind a logo." Reuben slowly turned his head to look at Big Hank, who was standing at strict attention, his hands clasped behind his back, awaiting orders. "Hank," Reuben said quietly, "this club was built on a foundation of absolute respect and brotherhood. If a man cannot respect the very ground he walks on, he has no business wearing the winged skull. He is a liability. He is an embarrassment to every man who took a bullet for that patch." Hank nodded once, his face carved from unyielding granite. "Understood, brother." Reuben turned back to Garrett. The finality in his eyes was absolute. There would be no second chances, no probation, no grueling physical punishment to earn his way back into the good graces of the Charter. The verdict had been delivered by the highest possible court, and it was devastatingly permanent. "Take his cut," Reuben commanded softly. Garrett let out a choked, desperate sob. "No. Please, please, Reuben, I'll do anything. I'll prospect again. I'll clean the clubhouse with a toothbrush for a year. Please don't take my colors. It's my entire life." "You gave up your life the moment you laid hands on a civilian," Reuben replied coldly, showing absolutely no mercy. "You don't deserve the leather." Hank stepped forward, completely ignoring Garrett's pathetic, sobbing pleas. The massive sergeant-at-arms reached down and violently grabbed the collar of Garrett's pristine denim vest. With one brutal, tearing motion, Hank hauled the young man to his feet and ripped the vest clean off his shoulders. The heavy metal snaps popped like distant gunfire, echoing loudly in the quiet bar. Garrett stood there in a plain black t-shirt, completely stripped of his identity, his power, and his brotherhood. He looked small, insignificant, and entirely shattered. Dexter and Wyatt watched in horrified, breathless silence, deeply aware that they had narrowly escaped the exact same fate by mere seconds. Hank folded the denim vest with military precision, tucking the sacred death head patch safely under his massive arm. He looked at Garrett with pure, unadulterated disgust. "You have exactly 1 hour to get your motorcycle out of this city," Hank growled, his voice a lethal threat. "If I ever see your face in Oakland again, if I ever catch you wearing anything remotely resembling our colors, I will put you in the ground myself. Get out of my sight." Garrett didn't hesitate. Tears streaming down his face, his rib cage throbbing in agony. He turned and practically sprinted for the heavy wooden doors. He burst out into the afternoon sunlight, the roaring engine of his fuel-injected Harley sparking to life moments later, followed by the screeching of tires as he fled the territory he had claimed to rule just 20 minutes prior. Dexter and Wyatt remained frozen in place, too terrified to even breathe. Reuben didn't bother to address them. He had made his point. The disease had been excised, and the lesson had been permanently carved into the minds of the survivors. He slowly turned around, walking past the shattered table and the stunned bartender, Loretta, who was staring at him with wide, reverent eyes. "Put his drinks on my tab, Loretta," Reuben said softly, tossing a crumpled $50 bill onto the polished oak counter. "You don't owe a dime in this place, Reuben," Loretta managed to whisper, her hands shaking as she pushed the money back toward him. "Never have. Never will." Reuben offered her a slow, barely perceptible nod. He buttoned his scuffed leather jacket, the faded, blurry tattoos disappearing beneath the heavy, historical armor. He walked toward the exit, his boots thudding softly against the floorboards. Hank stepped quickly to the side, opening the heavy wooden door and holding it wide for the old legend. "Safe travels back to the mountain, brother. We will clean up the rest of this mess." "Make sure you do, Hank," Reuben replied, pausing in the doorway as the warm California breeze washed over his weathered face. "The world is changing. The bikes are quieter, the roads are smoother. But the blood always has to stay the same. Don't ever let them forget that." Reuben stepped out onto the cracked pavement. He didn't walk toward the line of flashy, expensive baggers parked at the curb. Instead, he made his way down the side alley, where a perfectly preserved pitch-black 1948 panhead sat quietly in the shadows. There was no Bluetooth stereo, no fuel injection, no flashy chrome accessories. It was purely raw mechanical muscle, a relic of a bygone era, exactly like its owner. With one powerful, practiced downward thrust of his heavy boot, Reuben kicked the old engine over. The panhead roared to life instantly, a deafening, rhythmic, mechanical thunder that shook the brick walls of the alleyway. It was a sound that commanded absolute respect, a sound that resonated deep within the chest cavity of anyone lucky enough to hear it. Reuben kicked the bike into gear and rolled out onto the street, disappearing into the chaotic, sprawling traffic of Oakland. Inside the Iron Horse Saloon, Hank, Dexter, and Wyatt stood in absolute silence, listening to the fading thunder of the exhaust. They remained perfectly still until the sound completely vanished, deeply humbled, fundamentally changed, and acutely aware that they had just witnessed a true ghost of the highway ride again. The truth is, true respect isn't demanded loudly. It's earned quietly, forged in the fires of history. Garrett learned the hard way that you can't judge a book by its cover, especially when that cover is written in the original ink of legends. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more jaw-dropping, real-life motorcycle club drama, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride.